Okay, it's about time to begin. Yesterday I introduced Dr. Dale Manor, an excellent friend of mine, an excellent archaeologist. If you weren't here, I'll be happy to give you the Bible, but I'm not going to repeat it. Many of you heard it yesterday. I do owe him an apology. I said yesterday, I was reading from the Harding webpage, but I said he graduated from Arizona State University, and he graduated from the University of Arizona, which is kind of like telling a Bama graduate he graduated from Auburn, or an Auburn graduate he graduated from Alabama.
Good parallel.
And so I apologize, Dale, but he did an excellent presentation yesterday about Jonah and some stuff about Hezekiah, showing the connection between archaeology and the biblical text, and we are delighted for him to continue. We made a little change. I was expecting to take questions yesterday, but we didn't, and so today at 10 after, I'm going to give him the signal, and he'll stop, and if you have questions, that's fine. If you don't have questions, he'll keep on preaching. So, whichever way you feel about it, whether you want to fine-tune it to the things you want to know, or if you just want more information, would you bow in prayer with me? Father in heaven, we thank you so much for Dale and his abilities in archaeology and what he's accomplished for your kingdom. And we know, Father, that archaeology is not to prove the Bible, but we know that it's a method by which we can study and make clearer biblical passages. And we're thankful for that discipline and people such as Dale who engage in that fantastic work. Be with him, and we know he's prepared well, but we pray that he'll have a clear mind and that we'll have clear minds and that we will learn and we'll be better able to use this in our churches and our mission efforts and wherever we go to share God's word. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Randall. It's good to be with you again. I have three commercials quickly to make. One is I've already handed out to a number of you these little bookmarks of the Museum of Biblical Archaeology at Harding. It is a fairly new addition to the school, and if you're ever in the area of Searcy, I highly recommend that you come by and pay the $100 entry fee. No, it's free. There is a donation box if you want to put anything in that, but anyway, it's free, and all of the items in there are connected in one way or another with the Bible. And about 80% of the items in there are real, authentic artifacts from the ancient world. And it's really, really fun to look at this. One of the most unique pieces that we have is a pull toy with wheels that the children would drag around from about 1000 BC. And sort of surprises folks to think that people haven't changed much. Anyway, so I invite you to come to that. Two other issues. This is a copy of a book of a series of lectures that I gave at the Warren Apologetics Center back several years ago. Matter of fact, much of this first lecture is in this, although I did not deal with the issue. I'm going to need that.
We were trying to keep it from washing out your pictures.
Well, I'm going to need to read the text some.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, so these are $15, and then there's a book by my father who has passed away, entitled Adventures in the Pentateuch. I owe so much to my father for essentially everything in my life, and I hold him in high, high regard. And he was a brilliant man, an artist, a musician, a preacher, a lyricist, a poet, and writer, and he's taken the stories of the Pentateuch, some of the stories of the Pentateuch, and has told them for adults within applications at the end of each of the sections. Points and Pointers is probably the most valuable section of the book, and Jim Bill McIntyre wrote the foreword to this, and it also is $15. There's one sitting over here, I have one here. I have more in the truck, so don't worry about running out. Well, I only brought 7. Big books, you know. Anyway, so I invite you to have a look at those, and whatever. So let's continue with our discussion this morning. We're continuing our discussion relative to the Bible, archaeology and the prophets, and Assyria. And we're going to rush back a little bit. Most of you were here yesterday. For those of you who are not here, I'm not going to retell everything that was involved because we got to make some headway here and get into the next section. But as we think in terms of any given historical event that we're aware of, there are several strategies by which to elaborate and clarify what's going on there. You have the historical event, but when it comes to biblical issues, does the Bible have anything to say about this? And so for many of us, this is sort of our only source of information about a given historical event. Now, the historiographers will have a tendency to, if there's only one source of information available for it, therefore it didn't happen. On a certain level, I sort of understand that, but when it comes to the Bible, I think the Bible's in a different category. Certainly, at minimum, the Bible ought to be given, and any basic ancient historical source should be given the benefit of the doubt until there's other information to come along to nullify it. So the second aspect, or another aspect, is does archaeology have anything to say about this event? And then we may ask, what about art history? And then also the benefit of inscriptions that might converge on this event itself. And there is an event that has taken place in the Old Testament in which all four of these categories have impinged upon our understanding and clarification of the historical event. Now, this does not change the narration of the text. I think it enriches the narration of the text. It gives it much more texture on a broader level, not to violate nor stand in opposition to what God was doing in the text, but sometimes we as human beings, we have these additional questions. Several things that Hezekiah does in anticipation of the arrival of the Assyrians, who were they were sort of the Nazis of the ancient world, and brutalizing everybody that they came into contact with, first giving them a chance to defend themselves, to at least surrender. But Hezekiah engages in religious reforms, largely because he is aware of the fact that Israel has not been worshiping the Lord correctly. The Bible speaks very clearly about breaking down the altars and the high places scattered around the country that were Canaanite origin. Trouble is, the children of Israel adopted those and continued to worship there. And Hezekiah was certainly aware of the fact this is in contradiction to God's will, Deuteronomy chapter 12 in particular, where God explicitly says that when you enter the land, don't you worship anywhere you choose, but the place that I cause my name to dwell. There you shall bring your sacrifices, and there you shall bring your offerings. And so this elimination of the competing locations of worship was part of the reform that Hezekiah engages in. Obviously, with the arrival of a systematic military conquest, he's going to stockpile food, and the Bible alludes to some of this. He's going to strengthen the fortifications and build up the weaponry and the arsenal, and he's also going to secure the water supply, not only of Jerusalem, but of also some other locations. I'm going to skip the next slide and go into the blank slide, which is where I was narrating the speech out of the book of Isaiah, where the Rabshakeh comes to Jerusalem and he is berating the children of Israel, Hezekiah in particular, for his recalcitrance to stand in opposition to the Assyrians, what God has allowed their country to survive. None of the gods of the other countries have been successful in warding off the Assyrians. What makes you think your God is any different? And in all of this, the children of Israel, oddly enough, are quiet. But I want us to look at some of the things archaeologically that we have identified. We go to the site of Lachish, and at the beginning of that passage in Isaiah, Sennacherib is at Lachish besieging the city. And from there, he sends these emissaries, the Rabshakeh, to Jerusalem to try to persuade Hezekiah to surrender. This is an aerial view, and one of the things that surprises most people is how small the towns of ancient Israel were. We have a tendency to think in terms of towns as being large, well, like equated with Montgomery, Alabama, or Huntsville, or Memphis, or something like that. No way near that. Not at all. The largest town that we've identified in the ancient world in the land of Canaan is about 200 acres. Most of them range 10 to 15 acres. That would be the big city for the most part. And the area of Lachish is about 10 acres or so. But it was a well-fortified site, and that's part of the reason it draws the attention of the Assyrians. Because as he can knock off the fortified cities surrounding Jerusalem, it may intimidate Jerusalem into surrender. So here's an aerial view, the top of the tell and the slopes that are on the side, and part of the rationale of the slopes is a natural kind of accumulation, but at the same time, they would become part of the defensive measures that it would be difficult for an enemy to clamber up the sides of that. Here is a picture a number of years ago. This is 1985 when I visited the site, and using an old slide camera, so it doesn't have the crispness of the digitized work, but you'll notice how high the slopes are and how difficult it would be for an enemy to attack and capture the city. And then you would have walls surrounding this of 30 to 40 feet high. So the overwhelming kind of aspect that would intimidate at least most attackers as they're approaching the town. But the Assyrians are not daunted by this. They are going to attack the city, and eventually they're going to capture it, and Sennacherib is going to commemorate this event in his palace back in Mesopotamia. One of the things that we have available is what is known as the Taylor prism. There are basically 3 copies of these that exist, and we have a full-size replica of this in our museum, issued by the British Museum. But in this text, Sennacherib talks about fighting against 46 fortified cities of Judah and capturing them and other villages. And then he also says something about Jerusalem and Hezekiah, but I'm going to hold off on that until we get done with the discussion here. He's going to commemorate his capture of the city of Lachish, which he, by the way, is quite successful in doing. He's going to commemorate it in his palace back home. And here is a picture of the palace, and this section right here, where is the focal point, is about slightly smaller than a football field, to give you some size of the area. And you would go from the outer court through these gateways into that room known as room 31. And as you would go through these, you would pass these imposing figures that are designed to intimidate any visitors that come. Also, in their theology, to ward off any evil spirits that might want to come in. These actually are from Sargon's palace rather than Sennacherib's, but he had the same kind of thing in his. And the size of that, I realize I'm not the best of scale, but you get an idea there. And so this is the way it would have looked going into the palace where you would have an audience with the king. Now, we laid the groundwork dealing with the introduction to the Jonah episode of the extreme brutality that characterized the Assyrians. Now, mind you, as they would portray this, part of their rationale is to convey a message of power and strength on the common level to scare the pants off the enemy that come and visit you, so that they're going to go home and tell the friends back home, when the Assyrians come knocking, we better think twice before we resist them. So as someone is ushered through these imposing figures and the grandeur of all of this, you eventually go to the room there at the back, room 36, and in this room you're going to be surrounded by these paneled reliefs. And here is one of those. And these originally were painted in color, so that the contrast would be significantly greater than this black and white photograph, which is not much different than actually looking at the real artifact. But as you look at this, you might not be able to sort of make out some of the details. So I have a drawing out of David Ushishkin's book called Sennacherib, or Lachish rather. And you notice these 2 guys that are portrayed over here, and they're being flayed. And then you have this fellow over here who is being killed and executed with a knife in his upper neck, probably cutting a carotid. Now, mind you, this is so the visitors can see it. So as the visitors come in, they're going to have pause about this. And as you scan around the room, you're going to come to another view of 3 guys being impaled. The Assyrian version, a variation on the Assyrian version of crucifixion. Other portrayals have often depicted them with the post going up through the anal cavity, underneath the hip bones, and it's just brutal. And I'm told that they would be impaled alive and then left there to die in the process. And again, this is part of their PR strategy. How to win friends and influence people Assyrian style. And he didn't like the title, but I thought it was great. So this again is part of the point. Now, as you scan around the way, in the room, you're going to come to this depiction of the king sitting on his throne, and some of the survivors of Lachish are being presented before him. And the reason we know this is Lachish is the inscription up here, and if you're Akkadian, it's right on top of things. You'll be able to read this. Sennacherib, king of the world, king of Assyria, sitting on his throne while the spoil from the city of Lachish passed before him. So this is the capture of the very city that we were looking at the ruins of a few moments ago. Now if you go back to the site and look at some of the excavation, this is the siege ramp that they built in order to reduce the slope and move a siege machine up to the walls to batter it down. And in that relief, there are depictions of siege machines that are up against the wall that they have used in order to destroy the walls and the defenses of Lachish. The excavation has also discovered sling stones in the collection. Now, sling stones we have a very poor representation of. They are not little marbles like we have a tendency to think in terms of. They are this size. Basically the size of tennis balls up to baseballs and softballs. And to get hit with one of those wouldn't feel good. And David probably is using one of similar size when he kills Goliath, rather than our typical little shooter marble that we tend to think in terms of. And the Bible describes the sling stone sinking into his forehead. Now, what's going to give when a rock hits your head? It's not going to be the rock. It's going to be your head. And so these are some of the kind of armaments that are used. Now, this is an interesting commentary on the modern situation. I'm going to stay out of the political issues going on in the Middle East. But when you have the news media talking about the Palestinians throwing stones at the Israelis, and the Israelis are shooting rubber bullets back at them, it sounds like a terribly uneven kind of thing. But if you actually look at a lot of those photographs, a lot of the Palestinians are using slings, and they're slinging rocks. And the speed of those rocks can be upwards of 100 miles an hour. So it's pretty significant. Now, admittedly, oftentimes you'll just see them throwing rocks. I don't mean to undermine that, but I've seen some of these sling throwers, and the sling is longer than the guy is high. And so the centrifugal force of this being let loose would be terrific as it is making its way through the air. This is some of the kind of thing that Hezekiah is going to be dealing with. Down here below, there are some arrowheads, some iron arrowheads, and also some bone ones. The bone ones I find intriguing. Who made the bone arrowheads? I'm inclined to think it's probably the defenders, as they are trying to rummage around and find something to shoot back at the Assyrians. And I've often wondered how many times does one of these arrows make it back and forth across the way before it's finally broken and not used anymore. But I can picture the defenders at Lachish taking some long bones of cows and sheep and goats and carving them into arrowheads and mounting them on into the shafts and shooting them out, and then here it comes back and forth. But again, in the excavations of the site, they found collections of these scattered around. Another thing that Hezekiah did was to store up foodstuffs for the people. And the excavation at Beersheba has borne this out really rather well. These are the ruins of the site that it was being excavated in the 70s. And in the process, these are the archaeologists showing the site around. It looks better than this now because they've done a lot of restoration work. But these are large storerooms. They're about as long, a little bit longer than the length of this room. And they have 3 aisles, 2 outside aisles, a middle one. And this was discovered with storage vessels scattered all over the place. But one of the interesting things that characterized the northern end of one of these storage buildings was this collection of stones. And as the archaeologists are looking at, they see that these are very distinctly shaped. They're very squared as opposed to the field stones that are used otherwise to build the structure. And as they're looking at this, they come to the realization, one, these stones are not native to the regions. These have been imported from elsewhere, as opposed to the field stones that are local. And secondly, they can be rearranged and put together to form a 4-horned altar. And again, Hezekiah is described as breaking down the altars. Now, so what Hezekiah has done is broken down the altar at Beersheba, but rather than just toss the stones, they're going to recycle them. Recycling is not new. Okay. You often get the sense, listening to folks, that recycling is a great innovative idea. It isn't. It's been around for millennia. and they recycle the stones and use them as building material in the construction of the storage building. We have similar evidence at Arad, just down the way and so forth, of the decommissioning of the religious shrine in association with the arrival of Hezekiah. The reason I'm in that is just to have, again, a scale. In this case, I'm taller than the altar. But in the storage facility, there are these storage vessels. We refer to them as lamellate storage jars. And this is a picture of one of those seals. And I have a part of a seal that I invite you to come up and look at. And it's really fascinating to realize that this part of a jar handle is authorized by King Hezekiah. And this is an artifact from one of those storage jars, and they typically will look like that. These are storage jars that we have found at Tel Bet Shemesh, and they were busted to pieces, and then we glued them back together. It's great fun. And these were then filled with wine and grain and so forth, water sometimes, in order to have these available for the time when the city would come under siege. And you have to remember the Assyrians were extremely efficient in besiegement and sieging cities. And the Bible will describe them spending 3 years besieging the city of Samaria before the city of Samaria finally fell. And it's about 1.5 years that the Babylonians are eventually going to besiege the city of Jerusalem before it finally falls. Now, another problem that Hezekiah is confronting is the influx of population that have come from the land of Israel into the country of Judah under his auspices. And so he is going to build this wall that is going to extend westward. This is the original city of David and Jerusalem, but with this wall they expand westward to accommodate the population that has fled down here into the region. And I alluded yesterday to the people on the wall straining their ears to listen, because some of these people would have heard, if not witnessed, the besiegement and campaign of the Assyrians in the north. In 1967, when the Israelis captured the old city of Jerusalem and the West Bank, they feverishly went in and began to excavate, not knowing when they were going to have to hand it back, which is still a question 50 years later. But nonetheless, in this excavation, they uncovered a section of the wall that is referred to in the book of Nehemiah in chapter 3 and chapter 12 as the broad wall. Now, the Israelites were not real creative typically in how they name things. They sort of name them the obvious. So you have a thick wall that's the broad wall. I can imagine if they had a dog, they'd name it dog. And if they had a cat, they'd name it cat. Rather than giving it a special name, I'm being a little facetious, but there's a lot of truth to this. Am I not right, Randall? And so the broad wall here is this fortification that Hezekiah builds in connection with the expansion of the wall and the territory to the left. There are fragments of the wall that have been found over here on the far west side as well that I saw a couple of years ago. Now, one of the things that's interesting is this building right here. And there is an allusion to this. And stratigraphically, and I'm getting into archaeology a bit, stratigraphically what you have is the broad wall built on top of the other building. Now listen to what Isaiah says in chapter 22, beginning in verse 8. He has taken away the covering of Judah. In that day you looked to the weapons of the house of the forest, and you saw that the breaches of the city of Jerusalem were many. You collected the waters of the lower pool, and you counted the houses of Jerusalem, and you broke down the houses to fortify the wall. And you have essentially a description of breaking down the houses in order to build the wall. And so we have essentially this confirmation of exactly the kind of thing that Isaiah is talking about. But this passage also refers to the water system. And again, Hezekiah is going to secure the water system so that it will not be an object of sabotage and threat to the Israelites when the Assyrians arrive, anticipating their arrival. Now, this is a photograph looking down the Kidron Valley southward. And the ancient city wall would have been situated just about right there. The spring is down here just inside that little building on the very edge of the picture. Now, the lurking question most people have as they look at this, why didn't they just build the wall outside the spring? It's because of the way the valley works. There's the spring house. The wall was here, and then right when you get to the bottom, you immediately head up another slope on the other side. And if you build the wall down here at the bottom so that it actually protects against enemy on the other side, the wall would have to be so tall that it would be functionless. It would basically fall over, with the wind blowing kind of thing. And so they build it upslope, and the water supply is left exposed. It was through the water supply that David had originally, Joab more accurately, had originally gotten into the city of Jerusalem when it was owned by the Jebusites, and David took it into his custody, narrated in 2 Samuel 5. And so Hezekiah surely is aware of this historical reality of the vulnerability of the water supply. Obviously, when the people go out there to get their water, they're exposed. There's the risk that the Assyrians would manage to get to the water supply and sabotage it, throwing a dead animal in it, and hence corrupting and polluting the waters and making them contaminated, and hence the victimization then of the children of Israel themselves. And so Hezekiah wants to secure this, and there are descriptions in Chronicles about them counseling. Let's stop up the water supply so that it will not be victim of the Assyrian presence. And so they do exactly that. And one of the things they're going to do is, this is the location, there's the city wall, here's the location where the spring is, and they're going to dig a tunnel underneath a spur of land and bring the water over to a pool on the other side of the spur. And they're going to dig from both ends. They're going to start up here, they're going to start down here, and dig toward each other in the serpentine route. Now, you can go through this today. It's a thrilling and exhilarating experience if you're not claustrophobic. If you're claustrophobic, it can be extremely intimidating because there are no lights in it, and it's not really big. Matter of fact, you'll see how unbig it is here in a moment. So as we go down the flight of steps to the spring, we come to a point where the water is coming out from underneath that flight of steps and is flowing toward us. And here I am where I have to duck. It's not big. Most of the distance you can stand, all of you can stand and walk the whole distance. But it's basically that wide, almost the whole distance. So it's a compressed kind of thing. It's just enough for the water, for the people to work and dig the tunnel out. And it's even shaped in such a way that your shoulders can sort of fit into the slight bulge there. And you can see the arc marks as the adzes were swinging down, and the chips on the side of the wall, and then they cart the stone chips out and so forth. And then when you get past the middle, those cut marks are coming back at you. So they're digging toward each other, and they eventually get to the middle where they do a sort of a helter-skelter kind of thing, trying to intersect, and they eventually succeed in doing so. And they commemorated this in an inscription. The inscription is actually in the Istanbul Museum. This is a photograph of it. I was fortunate enough to see this a number of years ago. And the inscription translates to, and while there were still three cubits to be cut through, there was heard the voice of a man calling to his fellow. And when the tunnel was driven through, the quarrymen hewed the rock, each man toward his fellow, axe against axe, and the water flowed from the spring toward the reservoir for 1,200 cubits. So we have a measurement, and we can measure against that, and it's almost exactly 1,750 feet long, which would be a cubit. Me. Okay, little man here, all right, and 17.5 inches from elbow to tip of finger. The water eventually dumps out into this, we now know to be the pool of Siloam. This is the pool to which Jesus is going to send the blind man in John chapter 9. He makes a mud pack and tells him to go wash his eyes in the pool of Siloam. And the Gospel of John says, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which by interpretation means sent. And most people read that to mean that Jesus has sent him to the pool. And that's not what it means. He tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. The word Siloam means sent, because the water is sent through the tunnel through almost 1,800 feet from its origin to the pool, and hence, again, original kind of naming that is involved. And so it's sent pool, literally is how that would be translated. Now, as we think in terms of how this story ends, the Bible will talk in terms of these defensive measures that Hezekiah has put into place, and Sennacherib is going to give Hezekiah a chance to change his mind. So he sends another entourage, apparently hoping that Hezekiah will capitulate, By this point, Lachish has fallen. They've moved to Libnah, which, by the way, is under excavation, and similar confirmation of the same kind of campaign that takes place there. And so Sennacherib sends an entourage to Hezekiah, hoping that he will capitulate and surrender. Hezekiah takes the scroll into the temple area, and he rolls it out for God and him to read it together. Okay? And in Isaiah chapter 37, beginning in verse 14, Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it, and Hezekiah went up to the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim, you who are God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth, you have made heaven and earth. Incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see, and hear all the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to mock the living God. Truly, O Lord, the kings of Assyria have laid waste all the nations and their lands, and have cast their gods into the fire, for they were no gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore they were destroyed. So now, O Lord our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are the Lord. The Lord is pleased with this submission of faith. And the Lord tells Isaiah to go in and tell Hezekiah, they're not going to come to Jerusalem. They're not going to shoot an arrow here. They're not going to build a siege ramp here. You're going to survive. And the Bible describes it that night. An angel of the Lord goes into the camp of the Syrians, kills 185,000 soldiers, which gets Sennacherib's attention. And Sennacherib decides, hey, it's time to go home. And so he goes back home. He does live for, I think, about 14, 15 years longer, in which case then he commemorates the campaign against Lachish, but not against Jerusalem. But on that prism, he does talk about, and this is the famous phrase that you probably have read in a Bible dictionary or commentary, he talks about, I shut Hezekiah up in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. Now, this is how to lie Assyrian style. Okay, and he's not overtly going to lie. A number of years, when I was a youngster, a teenager, I was on the track team. Believe it or not, that was a joke. And no, I really was on the track team. My being on the track team was a joke. And I remember a track meet that was going on between the old Soviet Union and the United States. One of those attempts to try to mollify the tensions between them. And in this track meet, there were only two teams that are there. And the United States won the meet. And so the report was that the Soviet Union reported to their populace there was a track meet in which the Soviet Union and the United States were involved, and the Soviet Union came in second, and the United States came in next to last. And that's sort of what Sennacherib does here. Okay, that's sort of what Sennacherib does here. He does not admit defeat, but given the brutality, given the mindset of cruelty and inhumanity that characterized the Assyrians, that's one reason I wanted to lay all that network, going all the way back to Ashurnasirpal through the subsequent kings, Sennacherib, Ashurbanipal, it's a continuous kind of thing. Given the brutality of the Assyrians, the fact that he did not defeat Hezekiah and brutalize him speaks volumes. God had delivered them. All right, what time have we got? I have 7 minutes to begin the next session, which this should have ended yesterday. So bear with me a moment. The next category is going to be a little more shotgun approach. Where are we here? By the way, that's a dragonfly eating a fly. I'm weird. I am an archaeologist. Yes, the term is synonymous. I ever heard that. Okay. So, some comments on daily life in the ancient world. One of the comments made in Hosea chapter 5 is that the princes of Judah have become like those who move the landmark. When I used to read these passages as a youngster, I would think in terms of historical markers. I'll admit, fortunately, I refined my understanding. I came to the realization it did not refer to historical markers, but it referred to boundary markers. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 17, God, as he directs the children of Israel to go into the land of Canaan and go to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and half of the tribes on one mountain, half on the other, and the Levites are going to read, "Cursed be he who," and then fill in the blank, all kinds of things. But one of those is, "Cursed be he who moves the ancient landmarks." Now, the ancient landmarks are basically boundary markers. Most of the people in the ancient world lived in town and would go out into the field during the day to work, and then they would come back into town. Think in terms of the book of Ruth, for instance. A wonderful narrative that gives sort of an insight into everyday kind of life. So she's in the city of Bethlehem, she goes out into the field to work, and she happens to go to that part of the field that belonged to Boaz, chapter 2. So here we have an example of that. That part might belong to Boaz, that part belongs to Jaime Thudpucker. He's my imaginary friend, by the way. And so she goes to the part that belongs to Boaz, not the part that belongs to Jaime. Okay? And as you look at that wall that goes through the field, you recognize that's not going to keep sheep and goats and cows out at all. It's not going to curtail any kind of movement. It's not intended to. It's intended to be a line of demarcation between one field and another. Now, a similar example, and this one makes sort of more sense, the dotted line that you have coming through here is, again, a boundary marker, as it differentiates one part of the field from another part of the field. And in this scenario, if there is someone who is dishonest, of course that's never happened, but if there's someone who's dishonest, they could go out under cover of darkness and move the little pile of stones over a short distance, and then over several years encroach into the neighbors and steal, land rustling, if you will. Not cattle rustling, but land rustling. And steal the property. Now, we are sensitive to this kind of thing. If you've ever bought or sold property, inevitably there's going to be a surveyor come out, and you want to be sure you get all the land you're paying for, and you don't want to pay any more taxes on any property that really isn't yours. And part of this legal issue that comes into play. And this is what is under consideration here. And what the lambast here is that the princes of Judah are behaving in such a way that they are anathema in the eyes of God, like someone who steals property. Now, some of these passages in the Hebrew Bible that talk about the landmarks are talking in terms about the property preservation for widows and orphans. And so there is this ripple effect into the concern for those who are in need, who cannot speak for themselves, who do not have voices for themselves, and hence have to rely upon someone else to intervene on their behalf. Now, from the area of Babylon, here is another more formalized kind of boundary stone, dating from the 11th century BC, and the inscription reads, "If one shall remove this memorial stone, or burn it in the fire, or hide it in the earth, or hide it in a place where it cannot be seen, upon that man may Anu, Enlil, Ea, and Ninmach, the great gods, look with anger, and may they curse him with an evil curse that cannot be loosened." So the moving of the ancient landmark was not just anathema to the children of Israel and to God. It was a cultural issue that characterized a lot of the ancient cultures as they recognized the importance of property rights. And this is what's under consideration there in Hosea. Another passage is in chapter 8, where he talks in terms of palaces and fortifications. And you have, "For Israel has forgotten his maker and built palaces, and Judah has multiplied fortified cities, so that I will send a fire upon his cities, and it shall devour her strongholds." And there are various fortification systems and palaces sprinkled around the country. One of those is at Samaria. There is the palace at Samaria, built by Omri and Ahab. Here is the outlying walls of the city that would be fortified, and significantly, by the way, and we hopefully will come back to that. Here's an artist rendering of what Lachish would have looked like at the time when Sennacherib comes through in 701 BC. And then we have, some of you have seen this, the model of Megiddo that would have characterized the fortification system at Megiddo. So this is, again, an element where the people are placing their confidence in their fortification systems and in their luxury and in their wealth. By the way, that's basically what Isaiah is lambasting the people of Israel about, because they're doing all these things to prepare for war, but their hearts are not in it. Their hearts are not where their hearts ought to be. Hezekiah's is. Hezekiah's was. But for the people, the masses, they're putting their faith and confidence in the structures. And God is lambasting them through Isaiah in that regard. In Hosea chapter 9, verse 1, we have a statement, "Rejoice not, O Israel, exult not like the peoples, for you have played the whore, forsaking your God. You have loved a prostitute's wages on all threshing floors." Now, here is a picture of a threshing floor from back in the 20s. This was, again, the common mode by which the Arab Bedouin would gather their grain and winnow and harvest their grain. And here he is on the threshing floor. There's the cows over there threshing the grain. He's winnowing it. And in the ancient world, and probably not just the ancient world, these were often places that could tend toward loose behavior. As people begin to sort of rely upon their own wealth and their own self-provision and get a little tipsy. Now, this appears to be part of what Boaz is concerned about when Ruth comes there at dark, and he'll talk in terms of, you need to get away from here before sunrise, lest somebody recognize you and it create a problem. Now, I don't believe they did anything immoral, but he's trying to protect her integrity and her reputation because of exactly this kind of description that we have alluded to in Hosea chapter 9. Chapter 10, verse 1 of Hosea. You have Israel is a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. The more his fruit increased, the more altars he built. As his country improved, he improved his pillars. Here is a wonderful photograph of a grapevine and the grape clusters up high. And they're growing more and more and more and more property into grapevines. And they're not for table grapes. I have never seen the table grape that I remember, at least in the years I've been there. It goes to the production of wine. And wine is now one of the big industries in Israel, scattered all over the country. But wealth often begets arrogance. And again, an attitude of self-reliance. Moses warned in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 8, as God is speaking to the children of Israel and warning them of these dangers. Deuteronomy chapter 8, beginning in verse 11. "Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I command you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply, and your silver and gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness, with its fiery serpents and scorpions, and thirsty ground where there was no water." And he continues. "Beware lest you say," in verse 17, "My power and the might of my hand has gotten this wealth." Doesn't it sound like our country today? And an arrogant attitude of self-reliance. But at the same time, am I seeing emotion over there? Let me finish this slide. At the same time, in chapter 10, verse 1, you have the more his fruit increased, the more altars he built. This is a drawing of some of the altars. I'll show another picture of this at another point. Of some of the altars that were found at Tel Migna Ekron, scattered around the site in various locations. 19 altars have been found from one stratum at Ekron. And, what are they doing with all of these? And then these are some standing stones. These were supposed to be broken down. It looks like it's part of the wall, but there are 5 stones there that are lined up with a little bench in front of it. Here are 3 stones that have a little platform. If you look very carefully, you can see a tall standing stone there at Hatzor. These are both at Dan, and this one is at Hatzor. But these standing stones would represent gods that are being worshipped. So while they are worshiping, they're not worshiping Yahweh. As they gain their wealth, they're worshiping the gods that basically are viewed as sort of the sponsors of these things. And we'll come back to that. The bell has rung.
Anyone have any questions?
Yes, sir.
Oh, you've been digging at one location. How hard is it to get permits and cooperate with the local government in terms of, getting everything together?
Fortunately, I don't deal directly with that, but it is important that we file for a license to dig. That's contingent upon a budget. That's contingent upon a research design, what we're attempting to accomplish. It's also contingent upon us writing a report that's submitted to the Israel Antiquity Authority every year, and I'm the one that writes that. It's usually about 100 pages long. So I write basically a 100-page book every year. Nobody knows about it except about 5 people. But once that is done, then we're granted the license, and then we can go into the field. If we dig without that, we can be sent to jail. And I'd rather not do that, just for some reason. Yes?
Are you allowed, are there certain limitations on what you can keep? You have to keep all of it.
Everything that is excavated belongs to the state of Israel.
Right.
And that is the rule now. Earlier excavations, there often were decisions and agreements. Part of the goods would go to the sponsoring institutions, but most of the goods would stay in Israel. But now, most of these countries are understandably very protective of their own heritage. I've been in the storage facility where a lot of this is kept, and it looks like that closing scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's unbelievable. And it's there in Bet Shemesh where I excavate. But it's a hidden building because a lot of people don't like archaeology, and so it's not a labeled building, which is sort of weird.
Can you tell us a little more about Bet Shemesh?
Bet Shemesh is mentioned several times in the Bible. Our first introduction to it is in the book of Joshua, where it's part of the division of the tribes, and it's part of the what tribe is it associated with? I forgot offhand.
Dan?
Yeah, I think it's Dan. And it's one of the Levitical towns. That I definitely remember. And so some of the cities and the various tribes were given to the Levites as places, and Bet Shemesh is one of those. Our next encounter with Bet Shemesh is when the Ark of the Covenant is captured by the Philistines, when the Israelites stupidly sent it into battle thinking that they would be guaranteed a victory over the Philistines. And God allows the Ark to be captured. And the Ark is shipped around various places in Philistine turf, and eventually the Philistines recognize, all these weird things are happening to us, and maybe it's the Lord, and so they decide to send the Ark back, and so they put it on a cart, and 2 cows that have just had calves that have never been yoked to anything, and if the cart goes back in one piece, then it must be Yahweh, because otherwise there's no way in the world this would happen, right? But if it all goes crash and burn, then it's all coincidence. And of course, the Ark of the Covenant makes its way entirely back to Bet Shemesh, and that's the first place it stops. And there's a sacrifice that is made there, and it is possible that a temple that we have found at Bet Shemesh is a commemorative temple of the Ark's presence there. This was reported right at the end of November. I knew about it, but I was sworn to secrecy, not to say anything about it. But it's possible that this temple was associated, commemorating the event of the return of the Ark of the Covenant. And then there's later a battle that is fought between Ahaziah and Jehoash, I think it is, in the early 8th century BC at the site. Any other questions?
So along those same lines, is the Ark of the Covenant really in a building in Washington, D.C.?
If you remember the movie, it ends up in Area 51. If you've watched all of the movies, it's an Area 51.
I was in a temple in Ethiopia.
I'm of the persuasion that the Ark was destroyed. If you look at Jeremiah 3:16, I love that passage. It resonates so well. Jeremiah 3:16. I always want to make a banner and put it at the end of the football field. Jeremiah 3:16. But Jeremiah 3:16 talks about the Ark of the Covenant not being remembered nor made again. And that sounds like it's destroyed.
The Hebrew writer alludes to the same thing.
I'm sorry?
The Hebrew writer, I think, in his writing alludes to the same thing, saying that you used to have it, you don't anymore.
Yeah. But the Old Testament, I think, even implies that. Any other questions? That does bring us to within 2 minutes, so I can't get back into this.
You can't, I was gonna say preach on, brother.
Yes.
Can you talk about the pottery a little bit, the shape of those containers seems counterintuitive.
I'm not sure.
Well, and how they would make them, they wouldn't really throw that on a wheel.
Yeah, a lot of them they do throw on a
They
wheel.
wouldn't stand up. You
And
know.
some of them are crooked.
Yeah.
A lot of them are crooked. Most of your round vessels are thrown on a wheel.
Even though it looks like it, you know.
Yeah, and then they would, if you've ever played with clay, you can bring the vessel up and then fold it in and then make a fine neck on it. All in sort of one fell swoop. I say that as if I've done this successfully, which I've not, but I've watched people do it. You know, I stayed in a Holiday Inn Express, and so I know people can do this, and then they'll have to add some of the elements. The handle will be attached to it separately after it's sort of hardened up a bit, and they blend it in. But the sophistication of the pottery creation is quite significant. I have a couple of pieces that I'm going to show tomorrow.
Is there an advantage to that shape?
The shapes vary. I'm not sure what shape you're talking about.
That kind of tubular one, it looks like it doesn't have a base to set down, it would tip over or.
Keep those.
Okay, the rounded base storage jars, which are usually about like this. I showed some pictures of them. Okay, the purpose for the rounded base actually has to do with physics. If it was a flat base, the weight of the material would bust through the bottom. But if you have a rounded base, the pressure of the interior presses evenly around the surface, and it allows it to remain intact. So what they would do is they would either lean these up against a wall against each other, or dig little shallow pits in the soil and cradle it in there. Or sometimes they would have another ring vessel that they would set, and then set the vessel in top of it. So there's several strategies. Now you have some that are pointy based. Those are usually vessels that were used in shipping on boats, where they would have cradles that they would put these in the ships and so forth. We don't have those typically in the Old Testament period. That does bring us to 1021, and thank you for your attention. To remind you of the books up here, and Lord willing, we'll see you back tomorrow morning at 9:30.